Welcome back. I apologize for the delay, but life has gotten a bit busy. Let's get back on track. What we're going to do today is take a brief look at the history of life on our planet. We'll talk about the history of our planet as well, and very, very briefly look at the history of the universe. I'm basically going to try to condense 13 plus billion years into an hour or so. Yeah, wish me luck on that. Anyway, as humans, we are kind of biased. We're biased in lots of ways, but scientifically speaking, we're biased because we occupy a small part of the universe and we live for a relatively short period of time. The universe is very, very old and very, very big. The sun that we orbit is a star, and it's thought that there's 100 billion stars just in our galaxy, and it's thought that there are 100 billion galaxies. It's thought that the Earth is over 4.5 billion years old, and of course our lifespans are much, much shorter than that. I don't say this to make you feel insignificant. If anything, you should feel very significant. We are lucky enough to have found ourselves on a planet that supports life. We are lucky enough to experience all this amazing stuff that we can try to wrap our heads around. Our human bias is something we'll address a few times in this course. We have a difficult time wrapping our heads around things that are really, really big, like the universe, like the solar system even. We have difficulty understanding things that are really small, like molecules and atoms and parts of atoms. How do we study things that are on a scale that's so different from the scale that we live in as humans? And when it comes to time, we have a difficult time understanding things that happen really slowly, like evolution, or understanding the age of the Earth or the age of the universe. We have a difficult time understanding things that happen really fast, too. Chemical reactions that happen in the tiniest fraction of a millisecond. That's something that we have a difficult time understanding. And like I said, we'll keep those biases in mind as we go along. All right, so back to what has happened to bring us up to this point. Let's go back to the very beginning. It's thought that the Big Bang that created the universe occurred about 13.8 billion years ago. That's a long time ago. The Big Bang wasn't a typical explosion. If you explodify something, you are basically creating this expansion within pre-existing space. But that's not what the Big Bang is. The Big Bang created three-dimensional space. It was an expansion of three-dimensional space. This isn't a course about astronomy. It's not a course about theoretical physics, so we won't spend too much time on this. What was there before the Big Bang? Who knows? Has the Big Bang occurred over and over again? Do we have a Big Bang followed by a big crunch where the universe collapses and then another Big Bang again? These are difficult topics that are a bit beyond the scope of this course. But we do think that the universe is expanding and it can all be traced back to a point 13.8 billion years ago. 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth formed. So we have the solar system forming as a disk of debris. And that disk was rotating, material collected in the middle to form the sun, and then later on debris collected to form the planets. 4.5 billion years ago, we have the formation of the Earth. The Earth would have started out as a molten sphere of molten rock. 4.1 to 3.5 billion years ago, we have the appearance of the first prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are considered the simplest life forms, the bacteria that you're probably familiar with, and also a group known as archaea. So notice this happened pretty quickly, I should mention, though, that for all of these dates, there's huge error bars on them because, of course, we are doing a bit of speculation here. We do not have a time machine. We can't go back and know for sure. We have to look at evidence that's available and come up with our best guesses, our best conclusions. So the Earth had to cool, the crust had to form, the oceans would have formed. A lot of the water from the oceans would have come from water vapor expelled from volcanoes. All of that took a bit of time. But all in all, considering, life formed relatively quickly. As soon as we had a solid crust and we had some liquid water, events happened that led us to our first cells. 3.2 to 2.4 billion years ago, some of these cells started undergoing photosynthesis. This is a process where carbon dioxide is taken out of the atmosphere. The carbon is pulled off of the carbon dioxide and used to make sugars and proteins, etc. And in the process, water is split, and that creates some oxygen. That's pretty important because oxygen started to build up in the atmosphere. It took quite a while. The very, very early atmosphere of the Earth contained no oxygen. The oxygen that we breathe today, so oxygen makes up about 21% of the Earth's atmosphere, that oxygen came from photosynthesis. With photosynthesis, we started to see the evolution of cells that could use that oxygen that was available in the atmosphere to fully break down their food and release more energy. We'll talk about that in a bit. But of course, if you have oxygen available, you can essentially burn or break down food molecules more completely, get more energy. At this time, we also had the appearance of eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are more advanced cells. We are built out of eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus and they have organelles. They have more parts to them, as we'll see. We'll talk quite a bit about this transition in the future. 2.1 to 1.6 billion years ago, cells started to clump together and form multicellular life. The first multicellular life would have been very simple, basically just chains of cells. But over time, cells took on specialized functions. If we look at ourselves, if we look at humans, we have over 300 distinct cell types that make up distinct tissues. About 0.6 billion years ago, so 600 million years ago, more complex multicellular life started to form. And this ultimately led to plants and fungi and animals like ourselves. But you can see there was a very, very long period of time where life was extremely simple. Life consisted of single-celled organisms. How are we going to wrap our heads around this massive period of time? Let's help out our rather feeble primate brains by considering the entire history of the universe as one calendar year. So we're going to condense everything that has ever happened into 1 year because, of course, we can wrap our head around a year. That's a time scale we understand. This is an idea that was put forward by a rather famous scientist, Isaac Asimov, back in the 1970s. You might have heard that name before. He was also a very famous science fiction writer. So we have the Big Bang occurring at the stroke of midnight on January 1st. And current day is going to be the end of December. Again, the whole point here is just to make this time period a little bit easier to deal with. We have our Big Bang, January 1st, and space itself is expanding and matter and energy are expanding. We have the formation of galaxies, and this goes on for quite a while. It's not until May that we have the formation of our own galaxy, the Milky Way. So January, February, March, April, May, nothing happening there that's biological. It takes a while, of course, for planets to form and the sun to ignite and so on. We don't get the formation of the solar system and the cooling of the Earth until September, and then life appears soon after. So we've gone through most of the year without any sort of life, at least on our planet. In October, we have the evolution of photosynthesis, and oxygen starts to develop within the atmosphere. In November, we have the appearance of eukaryotic cells, so again, cells that have a nucleus and have organelles. And it's not until halfway through December that we see multicellular life appearing. So again, the whole point here is just to make you realize that it was a very long time before we had much in the way of biology to discuss. To recap, for the first 2/3 of our calendar year, there was no life. There was no biology. That's sad. But for the last third, we had, first of all, the appearance of prokaryotes, followed by the appearance of eukaryotes, followed by, in late November, the appearance of very simple multicellular life. Let's take a look at December in more detail, because that's where a lot of fun stuff happens. In December 15th, my birthday, by the way, we have something known as the Cambrian explosion occurring. This was a very rapid evolution of more complex multicellular organisms. Specifically, we have really good fossil evidence for the evolution of animals. I'm going to focus on animals for December because, well, we're humans, we're biased, and we're animals. So during the Cambrian explosion, we had the appearance of all the major groups, the phyla, of animals that we still see today. By the 17th of December, we had the appearance of bone in these invertebrates. By the 18th, we had proper vertebrates appearing on the scene. Now, these are organisms that had a spine of some sort, but it wasn't necessarily made of bone. We'll talk about that in a lot more detail. But they had bone or cartilage or something that would help support their spine and also, of course, protect the brain. By the 19th, we had the appearance of land plants. And I should mention that up to this point, life was almost entirely restricted to the oceans, but now it's moving ashore. On the 20th, we had the appearance of fish with proper jaws. That's pretty important. We'll come back to that. And on the 21st, we had the evolution of insects on land. Now, insects are still, I would say, perhaps the most important group of animals. 90% of all animal species are insects. Those fish with jaws gave rise to amphibians on the 22nd, and those amphibians gave rise to reptiles. On the 24th, we have the appearance of Pangaea. Now, Pangaea was a supercontinent. So the continents are moving around on the surface of the planet. They bump into each other and then split apart and then bump into each other again. This happens over a very long period of time, of course. But Pangaea was the last time that all of the continents were pushed together, and this did have a big impact on the evolution of multicellular life, as we'll see. On the 25th, Christmas Day, dinosaurs appeared. And on the 26th, reptiles gave rise to mammals. Mammals lived in the shadow of dinosaurs for quite a long time. Dinosaurs evolved into birds, and on the 28th, we have the appearance of flowering plants. 90% of the land plants that we have today are flowering plants, so this is a big development. Everyone's favorite dinosaur, the Tyrannosaurus rex, appeared on the 29th of December, and all the dinosaurs went extinct on the 30th. There was a large asteroid that hit the Earth and killed the dinosaurs and lots of other things. But for us, not necessarily a bad thing, because it allowed the mammals to get out of the shadow of the dinosaurs and have their turn. Now let's just take a look at the last day, the 31st of December. We had the appearance of primates, and we had the splitting of the great apes and the monkeys. 8 p.m., December 31st, the lineage that gave rise to humans and the lineage that gave rise to chimpanzees split. Our human ancestors started walking upright, and by 10:30 on the last day here, humans had started developing tools. By 1152, we had the appearance of Homo, the genus to which we belong, and just a few minutes before midnight on December 31st, Homo sapiens and also Homo erectus started moving out of Africa and migrating throughout the old world. Okay, let's end off here with our discussion of the cosmic year by trying to fit human history into this scale. The last ice age occurred about a minute ago, and about 50 seconds ago, we had our first cave drawings. At most 40 seconds ago, we began domesticating plants and animals and creating what we now refer to as agriculture. If you are a young Earth creationist, well, you probably wouldn't give much merit to this scale, but on our scale, you would believe that the Earth and all of its organisms came into existence about 30 seconds ago. At most, our written records go back only 15 seconds. That final second, let's have a look at that. The scientific revolution, where people started to look at the universe around them and nature more closely and started to apply the scientific method, that occurred about 0.9 seconds ago. And our first industrial revolution about 0.6 seconds ago. I've added in a couple of numbers here. Darwin would have published his book about the origin of species about 0.38 seconds ago. And we have only known for sure that DNA is the genetic material for about 0.16 seconds. So what's my point with this? My point is that the universe and the Earth are very, very old, and we have been here for a very short period of time. We are just starting to learn stuff. We haven't gotten very far yet, but hopefully that learning will continue. Now that we've had an overview of the major events in the history of life, let's go back and look at some of the details. And I'm going to start at the beginning, 4 billion years ago, with the origin of life. Now, the origin of life is a tricky thing to address. We do not have a time machine. We cannot go back and watch this happen. We will never know for sure how life first appeared. What we can do, though, is build some hypotheses based on what we see in living cells today, and also some experiments that we can do in the lab that recreate the environment of the very early Earth in which life first appeared. I should mention that this is a complex topic that is a little outside the realm of this course. So I'm going to go through it very quickly and just give you a summary of one hypothesis. And the hypothesis that I have chosen to discuss is the one that is the most popular. It's the one that's followed by the majority of scientists in this field. Before we get into that, though, I do need to talk a little bit about how information is stored and transmitted and processed in living cells. This is a field known as molecular biology. And in this field, there is something known as the central dogma. It's not as scary as it sounds. It just suggests that DNA is used as the genetic material. This is a storage molecule for information, and this information is passed down from generation to generation. DNA is also used to manufacture RNA, and RNA is then decoded by ribosomes, small organelles in the cell, to make the proteins that do all the work. Enzymes, for instance, are proteins, and enzymes catalyze all the important reactions in the cell. They are responsible for the metabolic reactions that keep cells and keep you alive. So very briefly, DNA is a double-stranded molecule. It consists of two strands of nucleotides. DNA can unzip, and then each strand can be used to make a copy so that we end up with two new DNA molecules, and that has to happen when a cell divides. So when a cell divides, we end up with two daughter cells. They each need to have complete molecules of DNA that contain all the information that was in the parent. DNA molecules can also unzip, and one of the strands can be used to make something called messenger RNA. This is a slightly different molecule, and it's used to carry information to ribosomes, and the ribosomes again are going to decode that to make proteins. I'm hoping you remember this from high school perhaps, and if you don't, I do have another video that will explain this in a bit more detail. I'll put a link to that, but we will come back to this again when we talk about viruses. It's also worth noting that on DNA molecules there are discrete sequences of nucleotides known as genes that code for the specific proteins. You can sort of think of DNA and RNA as having a language, and the alphabet of that language is made up of nucleotides. There's 4 nucleotides in DNA and 4 nucleotides in messenger RNA. Here we're seeing this process occurring in a prokaryotic cell, so a cell without a nucleus. This would resemble one of the earliest cells, but of course they're still around as bacteria and archaea. The DNA is going to be unzipped, so a small portion of it is going to be separated into 2 strands. One strand is red, and then that's used as a template to make a single-stranded messenger RNA molecule. The messenger RNA, as the name suggests, is going to courier that message. It's going to carry that message out to a ribosome. Once at the ribosome is going to decode or translate that message. It reads 3 nucleotides at a time, and each triplet, each 3 nucleotides, codes for 1 amino acid. That's what you're seeing at the bottom there. A polypeptide is simply a chain of amino acids, and a polypeptide is a fancy name for a protein. 4 billion years ago, the Earth was a very different place. The crust had recently cooled. There was nothing in the way of life, of course. There were oceans and there was dry land, but the atmosphere was very different. There was almost no oxygen because photosynthesis was still a long way away. And in addition to the nitrogen that we still see in the atmosphere, we had more carbon dioxide, we had methane, and perhaps some other gases that are currently uncommon in the atmosphere. These conditions may have allowed for the development of organic molecules. There have been a number of researchers that have tried to replicate the conditions of the ancient Earth. One of the first people to do this was Stanley Miller, and him and his colleague, Harold Urey, did a number of experiments where they took gases that they suspected were in the primordial Earth's atmosphere, zapped them with electricity, and exposed them to UV light. This would have been at a time in the Earth's history where there was no ozone layer, again because there was no oxygen to give rise to it. So there would have been lots of incoming UV from the sun. There would have been electrical storms and so on like there is today. So UV and also the electrical discharges served as a source of energy to modify these simple compounds that were already in the Earth's atmosphere. You can see the setup of his experiment there to the right, and he found that if he cycled this material through his experimental setup, after several cycles he started to develop some rather complex organic molecules, things like amino acids and precursors that could potentially have given rise to nucleotides and other important building blocks of life. Many scientists have also discovered organic materials in meteorites. So it is quite possible that other simple organic material arrived in the early Earth oceans through meteorite impacts. The very ancient or primordial oceans of the Earth were a weak soup or broth of organic molecules. In chemistry, organic refers to complex molecules that are built around a backbone of carbon atoms. But those organic molecules were nowhere near as complex as the DNA, RNA, and protein molecules that we have today. It's important to remember, though, that DNA, RNA, and protein are made out of much simpler building blocks. You can put these molecules together in the same way that you might build something large out of little Lego blocks. So DNA and RNA, they're made out of nucleotides, and proteins are made out of amino acids. And it's thought when this first began, there were already amino acids and nucleotides, or something very similar to nucleotides, floating around in these oceans. RNA is simpler than DNA. And it's thought that RNA was the first large or macro molecule to appear. Instead of what we have today, where DNA serves as the genetic material and as a template to make RNA, and then RNA is used to make protein, it's thought that RNA was used as a template to make copies of itself. And then that RNA could also be used to make protein. This model is known as the RNA world theory. The first macromolecules that appeared in the primordial oceans were likely ribozymes. Ribo refers to the fact that they're built out of RNA nucleotides. Zyme refers to the fact that they act as enzymes. An enzyme is something that makes a reaction possible. It speeds it up. It serves as a catalyst. These are quite simple macromolecules. It's just a chain of RNA nucleotides that is bent into folds and loops and so on. It also functions as a template to make copies of itself. And that reaction is catalyzed by this molecule. It does everything by itself. So you can imagine these ribozymes wandering around in the oceans, grabbing onto nucleotides, using itself as a template to put them into the right order, and then spitting out a copy of itself. At the same time, ribozymes can also put together amino acids in a specific sequence, so they can build proteins as well. There's really no reason for this. I can't say that ribozymes really have a function of any sort. And they still exist today. They're not found inside living cells. They're out there doing their own thing to this very day. You can imagine in the early Earth's ocean, we have these things wandering around, and they would have all different sequences. They would mutate and change quite readily. The ones that were really good at making copies of themselves would take up all the nucleotides. So after a while, all the nucleotides would end up in chains that were made by the most successful ribozymes. This may be one of the earliest instances of natural selection. Natural selection in this case is not selecting for an organism, it's selecting for a self-replicating macromolecule. On the right, you can see the steps that might have unfolded here. So we have these self-replicating ribozymes that are making copies of themselves and at the same time making proteins as well. Now imagine one additional step where we add a layer of lipid around the outside. You probably realize that lipids, those are fats, don't mix with water. If you throw fats into water, they form droplets. Phospholipids are used to manufacture the membranes of cells. And if you put phospholipids in water, they don't mix with the water. They will tend to clump together, or they'll form what's called a bilayer, where we have two layers of fat molecules. And those can quite easily wrap around and make a droplet. So now we have this situation where we have ribozymes. They're making copies of themselves, so they're serving as genetic material. They're manufacturing proteins, and this is all wrapped up in lipids. There's one more thing to add, and that would be DNA. So it's thought that at some point later, DNA was added into the mix. The RNA originally coded for the DNA. DNA is a more robust molecule. It's a more stable molecule because of the two strands. So now we have a molecule that can also serve as genetic material, and this is a molecule that has more staying power. It's less likely to be destroyed by UV light, for instance. At some point there was a switch where instead of RNA coding for proteins and also DNA, the DNA took over as the permanent genetic material. It coded for the RNA, and then the RNA was used to make the proteins. No doubt in the primordial oceans, there was a lot of competition between the first self-replicating molecules and between the very first cells, the protocells, the pre-cells, I guess you could say. There was no doubt a lot of exchange of information between rather different populations of cells. However, if we look at modern life, even though there's such a diversity of life, we see a lot of unity when it comes to the basic features, the basic metabolic processes of cellular life. So it's thought at one point, one of these populations of cells won out. And we refer to that hypothetical population of cells that gave rise to the life we see today as LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. We'll talk about this more in our next topic, and of course we'll keep talking about this throughout the course. Let's do some geology now. The geologic timescale is broken up into long stretches of time, known as eons, smaller stretches known as eras, and stretches that are smaller still known as periods. Usually, these divisions demarcate where something special happened. So something unusual happened, maybe there was a mass extinction or something like that, as we'll see. We'll start off at the beginning here with the Hadean eon. This stretches from 4.6 billion years ago to 4 billion years ago, and it starts with the very formation of the Earth. So we have that cloud of debris, that disk of debris that formed the solar system, and we have the Earth coalescing out of that. The Earth is a fiery mass. It's a mass of molten rock at this point. It's also the time period during which the moon was formed. So it's thought that a planet or a planetoid hit the Earth, a bunch of debris was shot out into the orbit of the Earth, that coalesced and formed the moon. But this was a period of lots of bombardment by debris, asteroids, planetoids, etc. The Earth, like I said, was molten, so it was an age of, I guess, fire and brimstone, which is why it was named after Hades, which is the Greek underworld of mythology. Following that, we have the Archean age. Arche means old, so that makes sense. This is stretching from 4 billion to 2.5 billion years ago. This is where the Earth's crust finally cooled, and then we had the formation of life. We had the first prokaryotes. At the end of the Archean and the beginning of the Proterozoic, the next eon, we have the first eukaryotes appearing. Then in the Phanerozoic, we have lots of very cool stuff happening. Notice that those first 3 eons take up most of the history of life. During the Phanerozoic, we start out with the Cambrian, which is part of the Paleozoic era. And this, like I mentioned before, is where we have this explosion of life, where we get this huge diversity of life evolving very, very quickly. I won't go through all of these time periods here, but as we talked about before, we have the appearance of land plants, jawed fishes, fish, Pangea forming, dinosaurs, the first birds, the flowering plants, the mammals, etc., the first hominids. And we end up with the Quaternary period, the last bit of the Cenozoic, and that's where we have ice ages, we have lots of large mammals, things like mammoths and so on, and the rise of humans. Because we're looking at geology now, we should probably talk about how rocks are formed. And first, we should probably very briefly discuss the structure of the Earth. So the Earth has not cooled completely. At the center, we do have a solid metallic core made mostly of nickel, but then around that we have an outer liquid core. And that liquid is moving. There's convection currents within that liquid, and that movement actually produces the magnetic field of the Earth. Around that we have a layer that is solid, known as the mesosphere, and then outside of that we have something called the asthenosphere, which is said to be plastic. And what does it mean to be plastic? It means we're not dealing with a liquid per se, but it's also not solid. The asthenosphere moves, but it's kind of like Play-Doh, I guess you could say. It's malleable, but it's not liquid. The asthenosphere, parts of it can sometimes become more liquid and form magma, which can then be pushed up through the lithosphere, which is the solid, rigid crust at the surface. And we see that coming up through volcanoes and so on. We have 3 different types of rock. We have igneous rock, and that is rock that cooled directly from this molten magma or from other components deeper within the Earth. So things like granite, things like basalt and obsidian, those are igneous rocks. Igneous rocks can weather. They can erode. Usually it's because of water, but also wind can help break down igneous rock. And igneous rock can be broken down into tiny little fragments. Sand, for instance, is tiny fragments of rock. Sand and silt, they're the product of weathering, and those particles can build up in big layers. They can be compressed under pressure and turn into sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock is important because that's where we're going to find fossils. So sedimentary rock is laid down in rivers and lakes and at the bottom of the ocean. Sedimentary rock can be buried under lots and lots of layers, and if it is, it may be exposed to high pressure and high heat, and it changes. It undergoes metamorphosis and becomes metamorphic rock. Marble would be an example of that. And we can still see fossils in metamorphic rock sometimes. Metamorphic rock and sedimentary rock, if they're buried very, very deeply or subducted, that means they're moved deeper into the earth, as we'll talk about, they can melt. And they can melt back into magma, and then all of this material can be recycled back into igneous rock when that magma cools. Remember from our earlier discussions that when sediments are laid down, we have older sediments underneath newer sediments. If you recall, that is known as the law of superposition. Really important when we're trying to put an age to different fossils. If we have an area of the surface that's low-lying, let's say at the bottom of an ocean, the bottom of a lake, then that would be a depositional environment. And what I mean by that is layers are being deposited, sediment is being deposited. If we have an area that's lifted up, let's say to form a mountain range, that would be an area that's erosional. That means materials being eroded away, it's not being deposited. Parts of the world can change over time. So we could start with one part of the world being depositional and then later becoming erosional. And for that reason, the fossil record is not complete in any location. We can never find one spot on the Earth where we can look at stuff that was recently laid down and dig and see the entire history of the planet. That's never going to happen. There's always going to be interruptions in the fossil record. And you can see that here. So we have 2 points here, and we've got these layers of sediment that are the same age, 1 through 7. And you can see at some points in time, the ground was perhaps lifted up and it eroded. So you can see, for instance, at site A, we have this 3rd layer, and then right on top of that, we have the 6th layer. And the layers have been bent as well. They're not running horizontal anymore, and that's because of mountain building and all these other things that are going on. And then you can see at site B, we have this layer, layer 5, that's completely missing at site A because it was eroded away for whatever reason. So just be aware that there are going to be gaps in the fossil record, but if we search the whole planet and try to match up these layers, hopefully we can get a pretty good complete picture of what's going on. We can use that fossil record and the law of superposition to fairly easily provide a relative date for fossils. And what I mean by relative is we can say that if we see a layer and it's got some fossils in it, and it's underneath another layer that's got some fossils in it, the fossils that are deeper are older than the fossils that are closer to the surface. That's relative dating. But what about coming up with an absolute date? Because we might want to know, how many millions of years ago did this particular creature live? Now, absolute dating is a little trickier. So what you're seeing here in this example, this is looking at the evolution of the horse again. We talked about that before. And you can see that we have this sequence of horse skeletons, and we can see that they change over time. And you can see the dates here, starting at the bottom. On the right here, we've got 50 million years ago. That's that bottom layer of sediment. And then at the top, we've got 1 million years ago. That's the modern horse. And we can see these changes, and that's great. It shows us how this group of organisms has changed over time. And definitely we can use the law of superposition to say that, yep, the one at the bottom there, definitely older than the one at the top. And we can put together this progression. But how do we get those dates? How do we get 50 million years? How do we get 1 million years? We can estimate the absolute age of a fossil, or the sediments that contain it, by a process known as radiometric dating. The number of protons in an atom determines what element it belongs to. And the number of protons is usually the same as the number of neutrons. But occasionally we have atoms that have additional neutrons, and these are referred to as isotopes of that element. Isotopes are often unstable. They break down, they lose protons, and they become something different. They become an atom of a different element. We know the rate at which many isotopes break down. When referring to the rate of breakdown or decay of isotopes, we use a concept known as half-lives. If we have isotopes within a sample, the amount of time it takes for half of those isotopes to decay is 1 half-life. There are a number of different isotopes that we know the half-life for. Some of them have very short half-lives, milliseconds. Those aren't especially useful. Some of them have very, very long half-lives. When it comes to examining the fossil record for major changes, so major macroevolutionary changes, the decay of uranium to lead and the decay of potassium to argon are probably most useful. Let's take a look at the potassium example. So potassium-40, that is an isotope of potassium that has extra neutrons. It's unstable. It decays over time to argon-40. And you can see that it would take 1.3 billion years for your starting amount of potassium-40 to break down into argon-40. Now, in order for this to be useful, you need to know that ratio of potassium-40 to argon-40 in the sample, back when it was formed. And then we compare the same ratio today. Quite often, when we're doing this kind of dating, it's not possible to date the fossil itself. Instead, we have to look at the sediment or other layers that surround that layer that the fossil was in. So for instance, we know the ratio of potassium-40 to argon-40 in fresh volcanic ash. So we know the starting point if we're dealing with volcanic ash. Volcanoes spew out ash. It covers really large areas. So for instance, where we are in Western Canada, there are a number of volcanoes that have been active in the past that have laid down really, really big layers of ash across thousands of kilometers. And what we might do is find an ash layer below the fossil we're interested in, and another ash layer above the fossil that we're interested in, date both of those ash layers, and then we know our fossil is somewhere in between those two ages. Now, I have to admit that the error bars are pretty large. So we get a range of possible dates, but if we're looking back at, say, dinosaurs and so on, if we can get within a couple of 100,000 years, that's really good. In most cases, we can't be quite that accurate. The number that's associated with an isotope is the atomic mass of that atom. It's the sum of the number of protons and the number of neutrons. Let's take a look at another example that I'm sure you've heard of, carbon dating. Most of the carbon, 98.9% of the carbon that's out there in the world, is carbon-12. It has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. But there are other forms, like for example carbon-13 that has 1 extra neutron, and carbon-14 that has 2 extra neutrons. Carbon-14 is unstable and it breaks down, and we can use it to date dead things, including some fossils. Carbon-14 is constantly being created in the upper atmosphere. What happens is high energy cosmic radiation from the sun hits neutrons energizes them, and they collide into nitrogen-14. Nitrogen-14, which is the most common form of nitrogen, contains 7 protons and 7 neutrons. Remember that the number of protons determines the chemical properties. It determines the element that we're dealing with. That neutron gets trapped and it knocks out a proton. And we end up with carbon-14, which has 6 protons and 8 neutrons. That will decay over time. What happens is it spits out that proton and it goes back to nitrogen-14. As mentioned, this is constantly happening in the atmosphere, and also we're constantly losing carbon-14 through decay, and the ratio of nitrogen-14 to carbon-14 stays the same. Living organisms, like this weirdly colored horse we have here, when they breathe in air, they breathe in that nitrogen-14 and carbon-14, and it becomes incorporated into their tissues. So in that horse, we have a ratio of nitrogen-14 to carbon-14 that matches what's in the atmosphere, so long as the horse is alive. Once the horse dies, of course, it no longer is maintaining an equilibrium with the atmosphere. The carbon-14 starts to decay, and the quantity of carbon-14 decreases. Now, this can be used to date dead things that are up to about 60,000 years in age. It works best for things that are up to about 30,000 years in age. It doesn't work for fossils that are older. And this is something that kind of irks me. As I was looking for images to include in this PowerPoint, I came across this, and this was published by the Encyclopedia Britannica. You'd think they'd know a little better. At the top, they show how nitrogen-14 is converted into carbon-14. That's fine. Down the bottom, they show how carbon-14 decays, and they show that it has a half-life just under 6,000 years. Also fine. But there's a triceratops in the image here. How misleading is that? Triceratops went extinct about 66 million years ago. You cannot use carbon-14 to date dinosaur fossils or anything older than about 60,000 years. You use carbon-14 to date Egyptian mummies, to date Ice Age mammals, that sort of thing. And this is a very common misconception that carbon-14 is useful when it comes to dating old fossils, when it comes to showing cases of macroevolution in the fossil record. And I just want to warn you that there is a huge disconnect between research scientists and the media that presents their findings to the public. So always be careful with what you read. University textbooks, college textbooks, they tend to be pretty good because they are written by research scientists, but textbooks that are used in high school, elementary school, things that are aimed at kids can be woefully bad. This unfortunately is responsible for a lot of the misconceptions that people have about evolution. They read things that are perhaps good intentioned, but they're misinformation. Let's continue our investigation of how the Earth has changed over time, but now looking at the surface specifically. The surface of the Earth is broken up into plates. The lithosphere is broken up into kind of like these puzzle pieces that move around and bump into each other and slide past each other. The first person who presented this idea referred to it as like skin on a custard. So think of a custard or a pudding, and you've got that skin on the top, that's the lithosphere. And then under that you have the asthenosphere or mantle, which is more fluid. The continental plates are actually lighter than the oceanic plates, but both of them float on this asthenosphere. The drifting of the continents is known as continental drift, makes sense, and the process by which this occurs is referred to as plate tectonics. The plates move due to convection currents within the mantle or asthenosphere. We have magma that rises up at these ridges, these rifts. Most of these rifts are located in the middle of the ocean. For instance, there's a very prominent one that runs up the middle of the Atlantic. As the magma rises up, it moves away from that ridge and cools and gives rise to new crust. That forces the plates apart. At these mid-ocean rifts, we see lots of activity. We see oceanic vents, for instance, as you can see here. We have hot gases that are full of sulfur and other compounds that are welling up from deep in the earth. The Earth's crust is therefore basically a conveyor belt. We have these spreading ridges. These are known as divergent plate boundaries, and brand new crust is being built here. You can see in this example we've got oceanic crust or oceanic lithosphere being made. That's pushed aside, and eventually it will come into contact with a continental plate. The continental plates ride a bit higher, so the oceanic plate is forced underneath, and that's called subduction. This occurs at convergent plate boundaries. So this is where plates are smashing into each other. That subducting plate will be melted, and it's melted into magma. And we have lots of volcanic activity in these areas. But the plates don't always just smash into each other. Sometimes they slide past each other. And that's something referred to as a transform plate boundary. Plates move pretty slowly. They move a few centimeters per year. Again, where we have one plate diving under another, we have an excess of magma being produced, and we get lots of volcanic activity, as you can see on the maps here. Where plates are also bumping up against each other and sliding past each other, we get earthquakes. So what happens here is because the plate boundaries are quite irregular, they get caught on each other. Pressure builds up, and eventually they'll jump a few feet perhaps, and that can be quite devastating. There's an image down in the lower left corner of a rather famous earthquake that occurred in the 70s in Alaska. At convergent boundaries, where one plate is forced under another, the plate on top is crumpled to some extent, kind of like pushing on a piece of paper and crumpling it. That results in volcanism, as we talked about, but it also results in mountain building. That crumpling forces up the land. On the right here, we can see that India, the plate that's carrying it, has smashed into the Eurasian plate. This is a big collision, and it's still occurring. And this has created the Himalayan mountains. And they're still being pushed up. They get a few centimeters higher every year. Divergent boundaries, or rifts, don't just occur at the bottom of the ocean. They can form within the middle of a continent. And what happens in this case is we get a valley forming, and that valley may eventually make contact with the ocean, and then the valley floods. As this proceeds, we get a new ocean forming, and that rift becomes a mid-oceanic rift or ridge. This is currently happening in Africa. In fact, this is the process that made the Red Sea. And there are other rift valleys in Africa as well. The African plate is currently being ripped in two. The Rift Valley that runs down the middle of the Red Sea extends down the eastern part of Africa. In about 10 million years or so, that rift will flood and we'll have a new ocean. This rift is particularly interesting because it's also the birthplace of humanity. In the Eastern Rift Valley, the very first hominids appeared. In the north of Scotland, there's a very prominent transform boundary, also known as a fault. This is where two plates are sliding past each other. The northern part of Scotland is quite literally sliding past the rest of the United Kingdom. And this fault line contains a number of lakes, including Loch Ness, where Nessie may or may not live. Probably not. Down the bottom left, we have another very famous fault. This is the San Andreas Fault. And it's a problematic one because it hasn't been moving very much lately, which means the plates are kind of stuck and they may take a sudden jump. And of course, that could result in a rather devastating earthquake. 200 to 300 million years ago, all the continents were pushed together into one great big supercontinent named Pangaea, which literally means all the lands. The continents, of course, have since separated again, so we have new divergent boundaries that formed between the continents and pushed them apart. And they're still moving away from each other and bumping into each other in some cases. Now, of course, because the Earth is a sphere, they will all eventually clump together on the other side of the Earth. And this is a cycle that continues over and over and over again. By the way, if you really want to confuse people, get yourself a bumper sticker that says Reunite Pangaea. As mentioned, when this idea of plate tectonics and continental drift was first proposed, it was thought to be kind of out there. But we do have lots and lots of evidence that this has occurred, and we have lots of evidence that all the continents were pushed together as that supercontinent, and the continents are still breaking apart. So let's have a look at that evidence. The first and perhaps the most obvious piece of evidence suggesting that the continents all fit together at one point is the fact that they all fit together now like jigsaw puzzle pieces. If we look at the continental shelf, that's the shallower area around the continent that was the result of shoreline erosion, we see that the continents do fit together really neatly. There are some areas of overlap, but for the most part, that's where rivers have emptied sediment into the sea and built out deltas. The next piece of evidence comes from fossils. We've identified ranges of different fossil species that don't make a whole lot of sense on the continents as they're arranged today. But if we put all the continents back together as Pangaea, these ranges make a lot more sense. I mentioned that the Himalayan mountains were produced by India slamming into Eurasia, and this is still happening, and those mountains are still being pushed upwards. Likewise, along the western part of North America and South America, the Pacific Plate and Nazca Plate are slamming into those continents and pushing up mountain ranges, like the Rocky Mountains. What about older mountain ranges? If we look at the western part of North America, we have the Appalachian Mountains, and that old mountain range extends up all the way into Greenland. This mountain range appears to correspond with mountains on the western part of Scandinavia, the British Isles, and Africa. And it's thought that this ancient mountain range was generated when those continents slammed together to form Pangaea. Then when Pangaea broke up, of course, the mountain range building stopped. And after a couple 100 million years, these once very, very tall mountains, probably as tall as the Himalayas, eroded to what we have today, which is really just big hills. Sorry, I don't mean to insult anyone from Appalachia. The Earth has experienced several periods of glaciation. What happens during one of these glacial periods is that more snow falls on the land than melts. And of course, that's due to the climate cooling. As this happens, we have more and more snow being deposited. Snow is a very reflective surface that bounces more radiation back into space, and the Earth cools even more. And this dome of ice builds, and it can build up to several kilometers in thickness. There was a large dome of ice over the southern part of Pangaea, and the weight of this ice caused the ice to flow outwards from that dome under its own weight. When glaciers move, they pick up rocks and they move them. They also drag rocks along the bedrock and scratch it. And we have these big scratch marks and gouges, known as glacial striations, that all radiate out from this dome. We also have great big rocks known as erratics. They don't match the underlying bedrock, that were carried great distances away from this central dome. So these striations, these glacial erratics, they don't make sense with the continents the way they are today, but they make a lot of sense if we push all the continents together. Recall that magma wells up along the mid-oceanic ridges. It moves away from the ridges and it solidifies as new crust. There's iron in that magma, and as the crust cools, the iron forms crystals. Those crystals align themselves with the Earth's magnetic field. Now, strangely enough, the Earth's magnetic field flips every so often. It's quite variable, but on average it flips every million years or so. We see bands of iron crystals that are oriented in opposite directions. So as we move away from the mid-oceanic ridge, we can see the history of magnetic reversals. And this only makes sense if magma is indeed giving rise to new crust and pushing plates apart. Our final piece of evidence for continental drift is direct measurement, and evidence doesn't get any better than that. We can actually measure the movement of the plates using satellites, and you can see that on the map here. So the plates do move pretty slowly, and they vary from about 1.3 centimeters per year up to 18.3 centimeters per year. We can confidently say that all of the continents were pushed together to form Pangaea. But you might be wondering why I haven't talked about what happened prior to the formation of Pangaea. Presumably the continents have been moving around the surface of the planet for quite a long time. Well, it gets kind of difficult figuring out the positions of the continents in earlier eras. And the reason for that is that when the continents bump into each other, they are kind of sticky. They pick up bits and pieces of the other land masses that they run into. What you're seeing in this map to the right is the North American Craton, and that is kind of the core of the continent. These are very old rocks. In fact, some of that craton is thought to date back to about 4.3 billion years ago, so back to the beginnings of the lithosphere. The accretionary belt that you see there consists of bits and pieces of other land masses that this core part of the North American continent has bumped into over time. So the story does get rather complex the further back we go. In addition to the continents moving around, the Earth has gone through many climate changes. It's warmed up, it's cooled down, and these cycles have changed the amount of water that's locked up in ice. And that has a huge effect on ocean levels. So you can see here, we're looking back at Pangaea again, but you can see the ocean levels are much, much higher because there isn't very much ice. And notice that about half of North America is actually underwater. Looking at the Cretaceous now, we can see that the ocean levels are still very high, and there's this massive inland sea running north to south right across North America. The western portion of North America, just east of the Rocky Mountains, is fairly low. It's a depression. And quite often throughout the history of North America, this has been filled with water. It's also an area that collects a lot of sediment, and there are very, very thick sedimentary deposits here. Even at the very end of the Cretaceous, we still have an inland sea. Again, this depressed area collects a lot of sediment, and this is the reason it's a great place to find dinosaurs. Let's talk about the process of fossilization. Fossilization is a very rare event. Only a small number of organisms are going to end up in the fossil record. And of course, many of those fossils are going to be destroyed by erosion before we ever find them. An organism that is buried quickly is more likely to be fossilized. If it's buried quickly, it's not going to be eaten or destroyed. And if it's buried under lots of sediment in an anaerobic environment, that means without oxygen, the tissues and hard parts are more likely to be preserved. Over time, the parts of the animal or plant are gradually replaced with minerals like silica. So water that's moving through this rock will leach out or dissolve the minerals in bone, for instance. And as that's happening, minerals that are dissolved from the rock are coming in and replacing the bone. So we end up with a replica of the bone made with rock, basically. The fossil record has a bias to it. So species that are very abundant are more likely to be fossilized and found. Species that live in areas where there's lots of deposition, where there's lots of sediment being laid down, are more likely to be buried and fossilized. And organisms that have hard parts, like bone, for instance, or shells, they're more likely to be represented in the fossil record. Very soft tissue, very soft-bodied animals like jellyfish, for instance, don't fossilize very well or very often. Sometimes we can find fossilized evidence of past life that isn't actually a fossil of the organism. It's a trackway, or perhaps a skin impression or a burrow. So in this picture here in the top right, you're seeing a dinosaur trackway. And what would have happened is a dinosaur walked through the mud, and then that mud was buried quickly. It was buried under a lot of sediment, which applied a lot of pressure. And over time, minerals seeped into this layer, and it became hardened. It became rock. Next to that, we have a skin impression where a dinosaur was laying down in the mud, and again, the same sort of thing happened. That mud slowly was compacted and mineralized and turned into stone. Down the bottom there, you're seeing something that looks like a fossilized poo, and that's exactly what it is. It's called a coprolite. All of these are examples of trace fossils. Here's another really interesting trace fossil, and no one's quite sure what made this. Probably something called a trilobite. We'll talk about them later. They're similar to crustaceans that we have today, but trilobites are extinct. And this trilobite would have scurried across some really fine silt at the bottom of the ocean. And then, of course, that silt eventually turned to stone. As I've mentioned before, there isn't any spot on the planet that has a complete fossil record. there's always going to be some layers that are missing. So for example, if you go to southern Ontario, you go to Toronto, there are 300 million year old shales. And then directly on top of that are very recent glacial clays and sands. They're only about 12,000 years old. Where did that 300 million years of history go? Well, the glaciers came down and they stripped it away, and it's gone forever. So you're unlikely to find a dinosaur in Ontario. It's even worse if you go further north. There's bare granite. The last glaciation stripped all the sedimentary rock away. Likewise, if you go to Africa and you look for hominid fossils, you're very unlikely to find them. You have to be really, really lucky. For two reasons. Hominids were not that common. And also, they tended to live in areas that were erosional. There wasn't a lot of deposition. If you want to find dinosaur fossils, you have to go to an area that was undergoing deposition during the time they were alive. And Western Canada and Western US are really good places for this. So Alberta and Montana, we had this shallow depression, this big bowl that was filling up with sediment, and that preserved a lot of great dinosaur fossils. I've had the good fortune to participate in a few dinosaur digs. What you're seeing here is a national park known as Dry Island Buffalo Jump in Alberta, Canada. Now it got that name because natives would drive herds of bison off cliffs here. But there's also a lot of dinosaur bones. In this dig, we were looking for Albertosauruses. This is a dinosaur very similar to the T-Rex, but smaller, and we didn't have any trouble finding bones. It's thought that there was a pack of these dinosaurs crossing the river during a flood, and they drowned. This is another dig in Alberta, this time in Dinosaur Provincial Park. They say that you know you're in Dinosaur Provincial Park if you can take your hat, throw it, and have it land on a dinosaur bone every time. And that's almost true. I had the good fortune to be allowed to wander into the interior, and yes, there are dinosaur skeletons everywhere. In this case, we're digging for Stegosauruses. And finally, this is a dig in Saskatchewan, and you can see Lake Diefenbaker in the back there. What we're digging up here is a mosasaur, a very large reptile that would have swam in that shallow sea that I showed you earlier. So we're wrapping it up in burlap and plaster and getting it ready to move out. There's one more really important Canadian fossil site that I'd like to talk about. This one is found in BC, right on the Alberta border. It's in Yoho National Park, which is just outside of the small town of Field. And the fossils are found along this snowy peak. This site is known as the Burgess Shale, and it's one of the best records of the Cambrian explosion on the planet. And for that reason, it's a UNESCO protected World Heritage Site. If we had been standing at this location 550 million years ago, we'd be underwater. This was shallow water on the continental shelf, close to the edge of the continental shelf. And in the fine mud at the bottom, we had lots of fascinating organisms. Many of them were soft-bodied. They didn't have any hard parts. And those sorts of organisms don't generally preserve. We don't usually find many examples of them in the fossil record. So there were things like jellyfish and worms and a lot of other things that were far more exotic, things that don't look like anything we have today. Now, occasionally, there would be avalanches, underwater avalanches, down the steep slope of the continental shelf. And these little ecosystems, all these critters, would get swept away into very, very deep, cold water. And they'd be buried very deeply, very quickly. And because the water was cold and also lacked oxygen, preservation was great. And again, this is a very special environment where organisms that aren't usually preserved were preserved. Over millions of years, that very fine mud turned to stone. It turned to shale. As the Pacific plate slammed into the North American plate, these layers of rock got tilted up to form the Rocky Mountains. Because that silt, that mud, was so fine, it preserves incredible details on these fossils. Some of the animal fossils from the Burgess Shale are truly bizarre. They don't resemble anything alive today. In fact, they don't appear to fit into any of the phyla, the major groups that we have today. It would appear that life during the Cambrian explosion did a lot of experimentation, and some of those experiments didn't pan out. So here we've got just a selection. Starting at the upper left, we've got this weird creature that's covered in scales. Not quite sure what's on the underside of that thing. In the middle, we've got something called Opabenia, which is really weird. It's got this trunk at the front with claspers on the end. Presumably it used that to catch prey. It's got 5 big eyes on top of its head. It's got these paddle-like structures underneath that it presumably used to swim. Then we've got some odd shelled creature there in the upper right. Going down to the lower left, this one's truly bizarre. This has been named Hallucinogenia because it looks like a hallucination. And in fact, scientists struggled for a long time to figure out which part was up and which part was down. In the middle bottom, we have what was thought to be an entire organism, and then later it was discovered just to be one claw from a very large invertebrate animal. And in the bottom right, we've got an organism that is kind of eel-shaped, but it is an invertebrate. You can see blocks of muscle running along the side, and this is thought to be one of the very earliest chordates. Chordates, that's a phylum that includes us. So this might be one of our long-lost, very ancient ancestors. Here we've got some artist renditions of what these weird critters might have looked like in life. In the upper left, we've got a trilobite-like creature, very ornate. Next to that, the animated GIF shows us Hallucinogenia. Again, really bizarre. Down the bottom left, we have our early chordate, and next to that on the right, we've got Opabenia. Truly weird, with these paddles, with these 5 strange eyes, and that weird grasping trunk. Continuing our look at major events in the history of the Earth and their impact, see what I did there, on the history of life, we should take a look at asteroids. Asteroids are debris left over from the creation of the solar system. There was lots of this stuff in the early days of the solar system, and the young Earth got pummeled by these asteroids and meteorites quite frequently. There are still asteroids and meteors out there that might run into the Earth. In fact, there's a meteor that's being watched quite closely right now because it has a 1.5% chance of hitting the Earth in 2032. So if you're watching this in 2033, well done. Anyway, there's lots of evidence for these impacts around the world, and it is quite fun to look on Google Earth or Google Maps and try to find these very circular scars. These scars are termed astroblems, which literally means star scar. There's a massive one of these in Quebec. The Manicouagan Reservoir is a lake that fills a crater that's about 100 kilometers across, and it's thought this one was formed about 215 million years ago. One of my favorites, because I've visited it, is much smaller, 4 kilometers across. This is Brent Crater in Algonquin Park, Ontario, and this one formed about 453 million years ago. If you ever find yourself in Algonquin Park, grab yourself a canoe and portage into the crater. There's 2 lakes in the crater. When I visited, I was by myself and I had 3 wonderful nights in this crater with amazing stars. And there's something quite special and humbling about lying down in a canoe, looking up at the stars, seeing meteorites, small ones, while you're in a crater. It was pretty amazing. As mentioned, there's lots of astroblems out there, including the aptly named Meteor Crater in Arizona. How original. By far, the most famous meteorite impact is the one that killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous. This mass extinction event is used to delineate the Cretaceous period from the Tertiary period, and it's often called the KT boundary. K is shorthand for Cretaceous and T is shorthand for Tertiary. Now, how do we know that it was a meteorite that killed the dinosaurs? Well, at that KT boundary, all around the world, we find an element that's rather rare on Earth, iridium. It's a type of metal. It's rare on Earth, but it is quite common in meteorites. So pretty darn good evidence. We've never found fossil dinosaurs above that iridium layer. We even know where this meteorite, this asteroid, hit. It hit on the Yucatan Peninsula, which is part of Mexico that sticks up into the Gulf of Mexico, not the Gulf of America. It's buried, there's a crater that's buried under the Yucatan Peninsula. Extinction is the norm. Individual species eventually go extinct. Some of them last a few million years, some last hundreds of millions of years. In fact, it's thought that 95% of all the species that have ever existed on the Earth are now extinct. They're not with us anymore. There have been 5 periods of mass extinction through the history of life. This is where many diverse groups of organisms went extinct at the same time. And this could be for a number of reasons. We could have, for instance, a massive change in climate. We could have meteorite impacts, as we talked about. The most devastating extinction was at the end of the Permian, right here. So we have these 5 lines here that are showing us when these extinction events occurred. And notice that the Permian extinction, at the end of the Permian period, wiped out trilobites. Trilobites were a very successful group of invertebrates. We don't have them anymore. Almost wiped out the crinoids. They were very successful. They never really regained the success they had. These guys look like upside down starfish on a stalk. Almost wiped out the corals, but they did make a comeback. Made a big dent in the ammonoids, which are squid-like creatures that live in a coiled shell. They look kind of like the modern day nautilus, although they're not closely related to them. The Permian extinction is believed to have wiped out 90% of marine life. There were a few land casualties as well, but it was mostly focused on the oceans. And what's thought to have happened there is that we had a period of greatly increased volcanic activity. We had lots of toxic compounds being released into the oceans. The oceans became poisonous and also acidic. The other very important mass extinction that we talked about is over here. That is the Cretaceous extinction. That's the extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs. It also wiped out the ammonoids. After this, though, we had an explosion in the diversification of mammals. And again, that's because they were out of the shadow of the dinosaurs. Fish also expanded quite a bit in terms of species as well. Another factor that can bring about mass extinctions are dramatic changes in climate, a lowering of global temperature that brings about ice ages. There's been lots of ice ages throughout the history of the Earth, and they tend to kind of cluster together. During an ice age, what happens is more snow is deposited in the northern and extreme southern regions, so towards the poles, then melts in the summer. That snow sticks around and it builds up. Now, snow and ice are very reflective. They reflect most of the sunlight back out into space. That means that we have a positive feedback loop. That's a loop, a cycle, that enhances itself. So as we get more snow, things get colder. As things get colder, we get more snow, etc. And we have this snowballing effect, I guess you could say. And the planet can become very cold very quickly. Positive feedback loops like this are fairly rare in biology. Generally, we have negative feedback loops. Those are self-correcting loops. So imagine your own body. You're too hot, you sweat, and then the water evaporating from your skin brings your temperature back down to normal. So it's a self-correcting loop that will maintain homeostasis in your body. But these positive feedback loops bring about change, and they can bring about change rather quickly. Dramatic changes in the climate like this can bring about extreme hardship for a lot of creatures and cause them to go extinct. But they can also favor the development of new species. The largest mammals that we've seen on the land were around during periods of glaciation or shortly after these ice ages. As you can see, at the height of the last ice age, almost the entirety of Canada was under ice. It was under more than 3 kilometers of ice in some places, and that all came from snowfall. So we had snow falling and accumulating and compacting under its own weight to form glacial ice. And the glaciers themselves were so squished by the weight of this ice and snow that they started to flow. And you can see the flow lines on the second diagram there. How do ice ages begin? Well, it can be something as simple as the blockage of ocean currents. These are the ocean currents, the big ones, the important ones, that we see in today's oceans. And you can see that water warms up by the equator, and that warm water travels north. And that prevents a massive buildup of ice towards the North Pole. If something were to block that flow, for instance, the movement of a continent, then we might not get this warm water moving up towards the pole. That allows more ice to build up, and again, that starts the snowballing effect. There are several cycles that likely work together to bring about ice ages. On this graph here, you can see a timeline at the top. So on the left, that's current day, and then working towards the right, we have 200,000 years ago, 400,000 years ago, etc., up to 1 million years ago on the far right. Down the very bottom, that black line represents changes in average global temperature. The gray bars show interglacial periods. Those are periods between ice ages when things were warmer, and you can see that we're in one of those periods right now. There have been several ice ages in the last 1 million years, which is kind of interesting because 1 million years is not that long, geologically speaking. All right, what are these cycles? Well, first of all, we need to realize that the Earth spins, of course, but its axis of rotation is tilted. It's tilted 23.5 degrees. This is responsible for the seasons. If we're in the North Hemisphere, the Northern Hemisphere faces towards the sun in our summer, and it faces away from the sun in our winter. There's a process known as precession that can occur. This refers to the wobble of the Earth. So the Earth spins, but it also wobbles like a top, except it wobbles over a huge period of time. We also have obliquity, And that refers to changes in that tilt. So that tilt is not always 23.5 degrees. You could see how these two cycles working together might mean that for, let's say, a few hundred years, we find that the North Pole or the South Pole is not heating as much as it would normally. And that could bring about an increase in the ice caps at the poles and bring about an ice age. We also have eccentricity. The Earth's orbit around the Sun is not a perfect circle, and the shape of that orbit changes. If the orbit becomes very elliptical, then the Earth is going to spend some time away from the Sun, and it's going to cool. And again, if that's the case for a number of years, and it lines up with the effects of obliquity and precession, that could cool the poles and cool the Earth. Finally, we have solar forcing. And this is the actual energy output of the Sun. That changes over time as well. So if all these peaks and valleys line up together, that can bring about a major change that can bring about an ice age. Of course, climate is really difficult to understand, and it can be very difficult to predict over long periods of time. And we'll talk about that more towards the end of the course when we talk about ecology. And we'll talk about how we're affecting global climate at the moment. The Earth has been warmer than it is now in the past, for much of the past actually. The problem is not that we're heating the Earth per se, it's the rate at which we're heating it and the rate at which we're changing precipitation patterns and so on. Organisms on the Earth don't have enough time to keep up with those changes. And because of that, and because of deforestation and pollution and hunting and farming practices and so on, a lot of people think, unfortunately, that we are experiencing a mass extinction right now, one that we are causing. But we'll return to that happy thought later in the course. Changes, ice ages, resulting from those cycles that we just looked at are superimposed on a much larger scale of cooling and warming that we don't understand all that well. And you can see that here. So now we're looking at a much bigger time period. And again, those ups and downs would be superimposed on top of these lines. You can see that right now we are in a cool period. For most of Earth's history, the majority of the Earth was tropical or subtropical. And a lot of that has to do with the placement of those continents as they move around. But again, right now, in our lifetimes, climate is changing much, much faster than it likely has at any other point. And again, that's our fault. Thank you so much for humoring me as I droned on and on and on about geology. I find geology really fascinating, but this is the only time I get to talk about it. Here's a few concepts here to end off with, and let's give Comic Sans font a bit of love. The universe and the Earth have been around for a very long time without us, and that shouldn't make you feel insignificant. In fact, I think it should make you feel more significant. You are lucky enough to be here at this place at this time so that you can experience all these cool things. Ribozymes are self-replicating RNA molecules. They served as the original enzymes and genetic material, but their role was replaced by DNA. DNA eventually took over the role of hereditary material. RNA kept the role as a messenger that's used to carry the code to a ribosome, and that's where protein production occurs now. The continents drift around like skin on a custard, as evidenced by fossils, coastline fit, geology, direct measurement, etc. That would be a good short answer question on a test. Talk about all of those things. Life remained unicellular, single-celled, for over 2 billion years. So life changed and evolved fairly slowly at first. Multicellular life appeared and diversified very rapidly during the Cambrian explosion, and that was 600 to 550 million years ago. And of course, some of the best evidence we have for what happened during that rapid period of evolution comes from the Burgess Shale, right here in beautiful British Columbia. Fossils are the mineralized replicas of organisms, or simply the traces that they leave behind. Fossilization requires very special conditions, and it's a rare event. And for that reason, the fossil record is incomplete, and it always will be. Unfortunately, there's going to be lots of things that lived and died that we'll never know about. Fossils and sediments can be dated absolutely using radioisotopes, or indirectly using the law of superposition. We can also use something called index fossils, which I don't think I touched on, but let's say that we have a certain species of crustacean or a certain species of snail. And these shells are easy to identify, and we have dated them, and we found that this particular species only lived for 1 million years, and it lived all around the world. Well, that fossil could itself be used to relatively date layers of sediment. So we can see that, oh, that fossil is there. We know how old that is. Anything else that's in that layer of sediment must be the same age. The Earth has experienced several major mass extinctions, and unfortunately, we might be creating one ourselves right now. And finally, just a very short terminology list with some of our most important points that we covered. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time when we're going to talk about how we classify organisms and how we try to figure out their relationships.